I like it, Steve.
Rough night. Work's killing me.
Well played, well played. All right. Good morning. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And hopefully everyone can see Steve. But good morning and welcome to this month's Coffee Talk. My name's Sean O'Brien, and hopefully my slides will advance today. There we go. President of QwickRate. And as always, am pleased to be joined by some version of Steve Huntington today, the skeletal type. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. That's all I can handle for that. It's getting hot in there. Hey, I'm Steve Huntington. I'm Director of Analytics here at QwickRate, and spent my entire career working with community banks all over the country. And more than half of that now has been right here with Sean at QwickRate.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. And we are very proud to welcome back our dear friend Paul Allen from Saltmarsh. Thank you, Paul, for joining us this morning. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good morning, Sean and Steve and everyone. I'm a director with Saltmarsh, Cleveland and Gunn. We get to work with banks all over the country on their internal audit, compliance, and loan review, and CECL work. So happy to join you and talk a little bit about what's going on with CECL and process these days.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Paul. Again, thanks to everyone for joining us. Just a couple of reminders. One, a copy of the slides and a link to the recording of today's Coffee Talk will be available to you, most likely in an email on Monday. Secondly, just a reminder, if you want to communicate with us during the presentation, certainly go ahead and use the Q&A box in the chat feature. All of you are muted, so that's going to be the best way. And we'll monitor that as we go. And certainly take those questions either in the midst of the discussion or certainly at the end of today's presentation. Let's see. Again, happy Halloween to everybody. As we've done here most of the year, we've started off with just a few polling questions. So we will do that today. I think there's 5 of them. So appreciate your participation in these and patience with these. And I'm going to go ahead and launch the first one. Most of them are pretty straightforward today. What areas, if any, would you like greater support in your CECL process? We've actually updated this, hopefully, so you can actually type in an answer. So we've moved a little bit beyond just yes and no. But if you hopefully can do that, then we'll go ahead and just give this 30 seconds or so. If there's some area where we can focus a coffee talk in the future, we certainly welcome any feedback as we get closer to the end here in 2024 and start to look ahead to coffee talks for 2025. So, and if you can't think of any right now, that's fine. Certainly email us and suggest anything that again would be helpful as you continue through your CECL journey. All right, so a number of you have responded, which is great. I'm going to go ahead and end this one, and we'll move on to the next question. All right. Support looks like, well, maybe I guess I can view some results here. No. Okay. All right. The second question is just around the ACL. Has your allowance for credit losses, ACL, increased, decreased, or stayed the same this year? So 3 choices there: increased, decreased, or stayed the same. Okay, we'll go ahead and share these. So 45% of you have increased them, 14 decreased, and 41% have stayed the same. So thank you for responding. Let's move on to the next question regarding Q factors. Have your Q factors increased, decreased, or stayed the same this year? We'll talk a little bit about this in Paul's comments, just kind of some things you might be considering as we look ahead. And again, part of what hopefully CECL does is give us that flexibility to try to look forward and estimate, you know, what it might impact our future charge-offs or even our reserve levels. So we'll give this one just another second or two. We'll go ahead and share these. 53% of your Q factors have stayed the same, 39% have seen an increase, and 8% have seen a decrease. So thank you again. Move to the next one. Again, past due loans, familiar questions. We'll probably compare results from earlier in the year, but are you seeing any increase in past due loans? Again, yes, no, or about the same. So pretty well evenly split, 39% about the same, 33% have seen some increase, and 29% haven't. So again, thank you for responding. And the final one, increasingly, we're getting a lot more questions. And I think regulators and auditors are probably asking a little bit more around unfunded commitments. So curious if you currently have an amount reserved for unfunded commitments. This is an area where we've discussed in the past. We've certainly seen a trajectory of this coming down as it appears, you know, most auditors and regulators are uncomfortable with zero, and the percentage of banks who have an unfunded commitment balance of some sort has seemed to be rising. So and this kind of reflects that. So I'll go ahead and end this one, but 91% of you do have some type of reserve for unfunded commitments. 9% of you do not. So again, we'll make these results available in the email that we'll send. Again, appreciate everyone participating this morning, and we will get going moving forward. And, you know, kind of where we start, since we have Paul, we want to take as much advantage as we can of his time and expertise. So Paul's going to share some of the things that he's seen, hearing, discussing with his bank clients. Paul, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. I don't think this is anything earth-shatteringly, you know, fundamentally new to you, but we are in a position now that we've kind of moved past the implementation of CECL, all the drama about which application do you use? What do you use for assumptions? How far back do you go? So we've put most of that in perspective, that we're going from the implementation. Now, most everybody, you know, is pretty familiar with what the CECL concept is. And so now there's a very natural transition that talks about what is the management team doing in terms of maintaining the model, how you go about using it, how you go about documenting the policies and procedures and so forth. And germane to all this is the fact that we have so much uncertainty in the economy now. Even before we had the recent storms, we had an increase in some of the delinquency factors. There was regulatory speak about concern about multifamily and office space in particular, but also consumer delinquencies. So there was obviously some discussion about what do you do with economic factors and so forth as we transition perhaps at some point into a different economic cycle. And then, of course, we've had the recent storm impacts, which have been very significant in some states and have certainly raised the question about, you know, what do you do about that? When do you start doing something about that? So, Sean, if you move to the next slide, I think we could talk a little bit about the transition from implementation to an ongoing maintenance of this process. And so you probably have had one model validation or have scheduled the initial model validation. I'll remind you that of all the models we use in banking, there's there are guidelines and principles about model validation. And most of that regulatory guidance talks about the fact that you would generally do it at the point of implementation, usually 6 months to a year after implementing a new model, you have a validation. But then it's expected that on an ongoing basis, either from a maintenance point of view, perhaps every couple years, or whenever you change a fundamental way of using the model. In other words, change the model or change a significant way. So, there's an expectation that management has been talking about that they've shared that concept with the audit committee. And so, once again, I'm an auditor. If you haven't documented that thought process, then why haven't you? So there's an expectation that management's talked about that, and there's a policy and a procedure in place for ongoing model validation. Secondly, the first time we implement the model, we spend all kinds of time mapping our general ledger, our loan trial balance fields. We set all of that information and made sure that from the core, it rolled into the model correctly. Well, as we all know, things change. We have new loan products. We change some of the features of loans. We have changes in our GL accounts and so forth. So mapping was a significant effort in implementation, but there needs to be a ongoing check or control over making sure that the mapping is still in place. And so once again, I think regulators and examiners will just sit down with you and say, what are you doing? What is your practice? What is your policy about checking the mapping on an ongoing basis? And then finally, the economic factors, we certainly spent a lot of time. Steve, I think you got 3,547 questions on economic factors, right?
That's the exact number, actually. That's impressive.
There was a lot of time spent on the economic factors, but it isn't a set and forget it. So what is the process in terms of how you will change? When will you change? Will you revisit economic factors on a quarterly basis, which is, I think, in the spirit of the pronouncement, is that you would revisit that. But there are some economic factors that, just to be realistic, probably don't need a quarterly revisit. So what is your policy and procedure? And then our expectation is that regulators are going to ask you these questions. And if you say, gee, I don't know, haven't thought about it yet, that's the wrong answer. So it should be documented in minutes, and there should be a practice and a procedure. So those are three things that we would normally think of in terms of the maintenance phase of a model. And so I wanted to just touch on those. On the next slide, we talk.
Paul, if you don't mind, we
Yeah.
do have a couple of questions. I thought we'll just
Okay.
take right here. So the first one is kind of going back to the unfunded commitments. Is it really necessary to move $3,000 or so back and forth each quarter for the ACL for unfunded commitments? So I'll let everybody else take a stab at this. I think the one thing I would point out immediately is that there should be three separate reserves. So I wouldn't think of it as moving it from one to the other. So again, you should have your general, just kind of funded loan reserve account, which is your traditional ACL, formerly your ALLL. You should have a reserve for unfunded commitments, which again shows up in the other liability section of your general ledger, and then the reserve for the HTM. So I wouldn't see it as moving back and forth. I think that's one of the things we want to certainly minimize, is moving money each time kind of senselessly, but it should be just established as a separate reserve. Paul and Steve, anything you guys want to add to that?
Okay, I agree completely. I would think that there's a general ledger entry that is a debit to provision expense and a credit to the unfunded commitment, and then periodically, quarterly is the most common frequency we use is quarterly reviewing balances like that. And you would look at that balance and say, what do I know today? And should we have that? Yes or no? So should we increase or decrease that? But I don't think it's a case of necessarily, like you said, shifting it back and forth. I think it's each one of those calculations are 3 separate calculations. They just all happen to go to the provision expense, but the balance sheet is a different account. So we're looking at 3 different reserve levels.
I think intuitively it makes sense to think of it that way, right? Well, I have a reserve for this one unfunded commitment, and now it's a funded commitment. So how is that? How do I follow that specific calculation for that specific credit through the process? And as Sean and Paul were saying, that's not typically the way we think about it. The way we think about it is, since we're not required to attach reserves, collective reserves to individual credits as they follow through and change, what type of asset or liability they are, it's, you do a calculation for your unfunded commitments. If at one point there's a total balance for those unfunded commitments and the reserve calculation is based on that, if a large unfunded commitment becomes a loan, you will see a corresponding drop in the total unfunded commitments balance, which will naturally lower the ACL calculation on total unfunded commitments as a bucket, right? And then you'll see an increase in your loan balance for that same amount, and whatever reserve you have attached to that segment that it comes into will naturally increase because you'll have a higher balance there. So it's really it's not a flowing through of that amount to make sure that amount has integrity as the credit moves. It's more just a recalculation of unfunded commitments as a whole, and a recalculation of that loan segment as a whole as the balance goes from one to the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so again, hopefully we've answered your question. If not, just reach out to us afterwards or your sales rep, and we can further discuss it.
I'd like to take the follow-up on the Q&A that's also about unfunded commitments for a second. You see that? Yeah. Someone says, since we're on the topic, what do you typically see the reserve for unfunded commitments as a percent of the balance? Similar to how you might see 1.3 to 1.7% of loans being in the the loan loss reserve, right? So I'll give you some actual values, and I'll tell you why I think that makes sense conceptually to me. We've seen about, for those banks, keep in mind, if you take total reserves for unfunded commitments divided by total unfunded commitments for the entire industry as a whole, you're going to get an irrationally low value. That's because about 40% of the banks in the United States still aren't funding a reserve for the unfunded commitments. Just on the call reports as of June 30th, at least, about 40% of banks in the U.S. had zero balance for their reserve for unfunded, even though they had an unfunded balance. If you remove those guys, so if you just look at the banks that do have unfunded commitments and do calculate a reserve for that unfunded commitment, we find it's approximately 35 basis points is the median reserve for unfunded commitments. Why do I think that makes sense? Because if you take, let's say, a 1.2% reserve, right? And then you include the factor of probability of funding. How likely are these commitments to become loans at any given point in the near future? Let's say that's averaging about 35%, right? If you take your 35 basis points of reserve and then divide it by 35%, you're going to get something like 1.2% on the funded amount, which happens to be relatively close to where we see banks on total reserve to loans. So the answer to the question is about 35 basis points. And the big difference between the two is, well, a lot of unfunded commitments never get funded.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. The next question, good morning, Luis. Thanks for the question, is around validation. And Ted and Mike and Tony, thanks for your responses in the chat. But for validation, can this be internal validation, or are regulators expecting an external validation? Paul, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, just was typing in the chat a response to that. You could do an internal validation. It would be theoretically acceptable, or taking out the opinions of an individual regulator, auditor, or whatever, if, and it's a big if the person doing the validation is competent, knows what they're doing, in other words, has reasonable knowledge to do it, and secondly, is independent of the function, meaning completely independent. They're not involved in it. And so that's generally the problem with having an internal validation of interest rate risk or CECL or anything else, is usually the people that are competent enough internally within the bank to do a validation are involved in the process. So that's generally why you outsource the validation, is you get someone that is, reasonably knowledge, does validations a lot, understands how CECL works, but is not actually involved in the process. So the biggest criticism of internal audits or internal validations and so forth by a regulator or an external auditor is that the person doing it is not independent of the function. So if you can meet that criteria, competent and independent, then that would be the same criteria that you'll be looking at for an outside vendor to do. Are they competent and are they independent? If you can do that internally, then that would be generally acceptable. Now, that having been said, we have bias by regulators and external auditors that say, well, you really should have somebody outside the bank do it. And that's just something you have to, overcome by showing that they're okay, they're independent and competent. So that's the concept. It's considered an internal audit. So, that would be the two criteria that you look at.
Perfect. That's a great answer, Paul. Thank you. Good morning, Ted. Ted kind of followed up in the chat. We engaged a third party to do a model validation. Our report says it's a methodology validation, and with the SOC 1 letter, should be sufficient. Paul, your thoughts on that? My comment to Ted was, yeah, that should be sufficient. Our SOC 1 stands up for what we propose, purport around the tool, and then having an external firm come in and kind of validate their methodology, et cetera. What are your thoughts there?
Right. That's the general approach within the regulatory guidance on model validation, is that you have the black box, the model itself, and you use your vendor due diligence to select that. The vendor then provides that, hey, every time 2 + 2 is in this, it equals 4. So the math works inside the box. But that's not all you need to do, because then you have to test, well, from an external point of view, is it your data going in? Is it your assumptions going in? And are there controls on the output? So that's what the method, what a lot of people call a methodology validation. In other words, how the user uses the model is validated, and then the vendor provides an external SOC report about the math within the black box. So those two things together touch the foundation stones.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. Mike's follow-up, again, just in the chat thread, for those of you who aren't following there, we just had an exam. They pushed for an external validation. We pushed back that we had performed an internal validation. In the final report, there was no mention of having an external validation.
Yep.
Tony's thread comment or chat comment, we had 2 external validations done. The first in November of 22 prior to the implementation, with the second in November of 23 after 11 months of calculations. Then in May of this year, we had a safety and soundness exam with the FDIC, and there were few, if any, questions outside of our choice of environmental or Q factors. So thank you again. And then Paul's comments in the chat, for all those, you could see it internally, would theoretically be acceptable if the person doing the internal validation is independent of the function. So great feedback. Thanks for everybody submitting those. Paul, thank you for adding that, and we'll move on to your next slide.
Well, the next slide just talks about the fact that even 6 or 8 months ago, everyone is talking about, hey, where's the turn in the credit cycle? So we keep waiting for this big turn in the credit cycle, and that's been discussed quite a long time, but we've only recently started to see some minor tick up in charge-offs. We've certainly seen some increase in the delinquency trends among consumer, and then in some sectors, multifamily and CECL. So, there's not really enough, Sean, to get your hands around to actually move, a significant increase in credit risk yet. But I would encourage banks to be talking about that in their committee meetings and with the board and audit committee, and tracking that very closely. So again, once you do see those trends, what are you going to do about them? And then if you go to the next slide, just wanted to update those comments that, we've been talking about for a long time. Well, recently, there's been a particular focus on CRE, ADC, commercial real estate, especially in the area of multifamily office and hotel. By the way, hotel is not consistent throughout the US. It's in pockets, certain areas. And the same thing with large office space. Mostly it's in urban markets with large footprints for tenants. So it's not necessarily the smaller offices or in less than urban markets. But we are talking about that. And then more recently, with the Fed moving rates up dramatically and now starting to go down, the loans that have been sitting at a relatively low, say 3% handle interest rate, and are now being ready to be repriced, which are estimated to be $1 trillion or a couple of trillion a year. Those loans certainly are raising eyebrows about whether or not you have some exposure with respect to repricing risk and the borrowers not being able to show cash flow. Now, I know that a lot of banks will immediately say, Sean, I've got a low LTV and don't care about, don't need to look at that. But I can tell you that regulators simply don't accept that. They will say, good for you. So show me the cash flows, stress test the portfolio. So, that was a conversation we were having before the storms. Now, if you are in a state or a market area where the storms came through and we've got a lot of questions about collateral valuation, sometimes collateral location, we don't even know where the collateral is, but certainly there's been a lot of stress there. There's an expectation that, first of all, we'll have some FEMA money, we'll have state and federal government funding come in, we'll have some insurance, but that's going to take a while. And so we have some uncertainty. So we're not telling you to go out and increase your provision or your reserves just for that, but we are recommending that you start looking at your portfolio. If you're not in a storm area, you might want to pick a bright line. $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, $5 million, all the loans over that amount. Take a look at when they're repricing. Take a look at, excuse me, what would be their debt coverage if they reprice, say, up 200 basis points or 300 basis points. I'll leave that up to you to set what you believe that appropriately would be, and have that report ready. When the regulators come in and say, have you considered? You go, yes, we've considered. At this time, we may not feel like any adjustment is needed on our reserve level, but we are monitoring this, and this is going to be our process while we go through. If you are in a storm area, I think you're going to be expected to produce a report of that you've contacted customers and you know which customers are impacted by the storm potentially. And at least you have that sort of identified. You have a report. John, it's a lot like the liquidity crisis. A lot of us sort of knew what our uninsured was, and we sort of knew what our large balance customers were. But now there's an expectation to have that report like right here. Yes. So I would suggest that might be where you need to go rather than trying to guess or twist the dial in the qualitative factors. I would start with do the homework, do the analysis, have the report, have some discussion. We also are hearing that in some of the areas where there's been storm damage, there's some form of a payment deferral offering. In other words, maybe a carte blanche. Everybody gets 3 months payment deferral until things settle down or whatever. And so, again, I would probably ask my management team, could we go back over the last few months and tell me, what are all the payment deferrals that we have right now? They may be on really, really good loans, current, low LTV, but I'd like to know what those are. I'd like to know, what deferral systems or payment systems do we have? And so, again, I'm not asking anyone to increase their reserves on those things. I'm asking you to probably go ahead and get ready for the conversation and have internal discussion. Does that make sense, Sean? Again, I think it's too early to change the reserve level unless you're just guessing. But information, knowledge is very valuable at this point.
I 100% agree, Paul. I think, again, I think the analogy to last year with uninsured depositors is spot on, right? That has become fairly quickly an expectation within banks to make sure that report is being shared with management and in some cases even the board. But also, I think echoes something we had said even in earlier coffee talks about that ultimately, the best source of support or defense of Q factors comes from your own internal metrics of your loan portfolio. And as Paul indicated, having the ability and documentation to demonstrate that you're on top of it, that you know what your portfolio looks like, and hopefully in spite of whatever happens or what kind of conditions you might be currently impacted by, whether it's debt service coverage, whether it's collateral values, what have you, you're able to demonstrate that, yeah, we believe our portfolio is going to, weather these difficult times. So therefore, we're not making a change to the reserve. I think getting that type of information from your own data and your own loan portfolio metrics, right, is ultimately the best source of strength for Q factor support, right? Because it's no longer at that point subjective, right? It's very objective that you are pointing to facts and figures of your portfolio as a source of hopefully strength in not needing to raise those potentially Q factors.
Steve, I'm curious, I think you'd be thinking this the same, but that kind of analysis informs what you are going to when you're revisiting your assumptions. So, it just gives you a more solid foundation to really kind of inform, hey, I may not need to make any adjustments. I feel really good about this, or I may want to look at, some of the other peer data a little bit deeper and so forth.
One area, Anna, I think, thank you for submitting to the chat. I would encourage everybody I don't want to read Anna's, it's a little bit longer, but great feedback just again on independent model validation, that how they conduct it at their institution. So Anna, thank you for submitting that in the chat. All right. So again, I think, how should that impact your CECL process and approach? Given what we just covered and talked about, right? Again, I think, Paul, will let you again take it away from here, but, share any thoughts that you have from this slide as well, please.
Well, again, I think we've talked about this, but just being ready to have that conversation and the documentation, because, we haven't even talked about the fact that we have a pretty significant election in place, and based on the results of that election, I don't always accept that any one president can move the economy individually, but there's a lot of discussion about what will happen in the economy. So I think that you should have some conversations about what are we expected to do, and let the board and the audit committee in particular know kind of what you have in mind and so forth. That last bullet point was one that we've gotten a lot of questions about, and that is, everybody's having a hard time finding staff. People are moving from one job to another. So just be cognizant about the fact that, one of our factors is thinking about our loan and underwriting staff. Has there been significant changes? Have we made changes in our underwriting standards? So make sure that that's reflected. But really, the next slide, Sean, is the one that I was hoping to leave as a takeaway. And that's just, I would encourage you to take a look at what you're doing for internal loan stress testing, especially with the changes in market interest rates. That's changed cap rates. There's a significant focus on cash flows rather than LTV from a regulatory perspective. So you may say, hey, the cash flow is really indicating a problem, but I still go back to their current and they have a low LTV. That's fine. I just think you're expected to document that thought process. And then I think in number two, so far, any areas that hit by the storm, the appropriate and proper focus has been on our customers and employees, housing, safety, food, access to power. That's totally appropriate. That's where we should be thinking. But I think that soon, when those things are starting to get resolved, there's going to be an expectation. Have you looked at your portfolio and considered whether there's any impact on your portfolio? So I think that that's an expectation. And then finally, that last point, just ensuring that once we got the CECL model in place, now we're backfilling with written procedures, policies, annual review with an audit committee or a governance committee of what we're doing, how we're doing it, so forth. So just encourage you to go back and make sure you're backfilling, because I know everybody's been working super hard, but in a lot of hours just to get the thing in place and make it operational. Well, now it's time to probably backfill and make sure that we've got the documentation.
Agreed. And I would just add, right, so within QwickAnalytics, we have a portfolio level stress test, but our IntelliCredit team has built and now is conducting, a number of loan level stress tests. We do it as a service, but I will say this year we've seen, a significant uptick in interest around stress testing for this exact reason. And so if it is something you're looking to do and can't adequately do it, or don't feel like you can do it internally, I would certainly suggest to you to call our team at IntelliCredit and talk to them about how they might be able to assist with any stress testing that you might be looking to do or being asked to do by auditors or regulators. Just a comment or a question about
the Q&A.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a question
Yes.
about whether
Access.
we've implemented access control and
Yes.
a better user management system for not just for CECL but for all QwickAnalytics. And the answer is yes, we have. So be happy to walk you through it. I believe I have a let me see if we have a video.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure we have a video on it from one.
Yeah, we do. So for anyone who's interested, wants to learn more about it and doesn't know about it at this point, if you go to our knowledge base on our website or on the CECLSolver, there's a big knowledge base button.
Hey Steve, why don't you just go ahead and okay, I'll stop the screen. Yeah, I'll just stop the screen. Yeah, Tim, we'll show you live here where that is to be found. Go ahead, Steve.
All right. I don't know. Share. So if you click on the knowledge base part of the website, you'll get this new tab pops up. And if you click on the Helpful Hints Video Resource Library, it pops up with a pop-up. And I believe right
on the overview, on user management.
It's on the overview. I didn't even need to do this.
Yeah.
So user management and access control. So actually right here on the main on the overview page, sorry. So when you first log in to open up CECLSolver, there's a new box, a newish box up here that says user management and access control. If you click on that, it's going to, or I'll show you real quick. It's a service called Loom, which provides video clips that we've done with full transcripts and everything else. So you actually will be able to go here, click on this, listen to us discuss the new user management and access control system, and actually follow along with the transcript of what we're saying. So if you want to see it in black and white there, it's all there.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. Tim, thanks for the question. Let's jump back into the slide deck here. Oops. Okay. All right. So, again, as Steve just demonstrated, we continue to make updates and enhancements. Many of these we've already discussed, but just again, to kind of keep them on a running total, we've got these listed out. We do have some, coming soon, some additional peer loss analysis and flexibility, essentially incorporating much of the kind of tools that we use in our portfolio stress test and bring that into our CECL tool. So Steve's going to touch on that today, but we'll be talking about that more in the future. As Steve just demonstrated, I probably could have just waited for the slide deck, but
That's all right.
we do have those helpful hints, both located on each individual tab, but then on the knowledge base tab, you can see all of them listed.
You can actually see all of them by clicking on the header there where it says helpful hints. Click on that, so you don't have to go to the knowledge base.
Fair enough. Good point, Steve.
Yeah.
Yep. So Steve, I'll let you take it away here, just if you want to.
Yeah, right now we'll just stick with the slides, and I can share my screen again if need be. So just so that's new a couple months ago. What we did was we've had some really good conversations on previous coffee talks about particular topics, and we want to, instead of, when someone asks about for some edification on a particular topic, instead of handing them a link to an hour-long video of Sean and I droning on about everything, we thought we would kind of clip them and create concise little videos that help about each topic, and then put them in the tool where they're helpful, right? So if you're looking in the digging into your historical analysis and have questions about how to change look-back periods, or what's best practices for customizing look-backs, or how is that multiplier, that lifetime look-back multiplier calculated, you'll see video links right here where we'll discuss those topics. So that's the video resource library. We'll be adding to it on a regular basis. If there's a particular topic that you don't feel like we've covered well on a coffee talk, or we have covered it, but you don't see it here, please send us a message and we'll find it and create a little video for it and probably stick it right here in the library. So we'd love some feedback on topics and of discussion that you do not see in the library. Exactly. Next up, yeah, we brought this up, I think, the first time last month.
Yes.
Decided to add, so every year the Fed creates this large document with lots of data, and it's created for the purposes of the DFAST, right? The large institutions that have to do the annual stress testing. But the best thing about that entire thing from a community bank standpoint is it gives us some really good economic data that goes back into history, a long period of time, multiple cycles, and then goes forward 3 years on a quarterly basis. So it's a really nice, trend line. So what it has is historical data. So we decided to take that data from the Fed stress testing economic scenarios and add it into our CECLSolver, add it into the QwickAnalytics in general, so that you'd have another resource for helping you quantify and justify any economic-based qualitative factor adjustments using actual the exact same line items that the Fed does and evaluates when thinking about stress testing. So here they are. Most of them are percentages like GDP growth, treasury rates, CPI, inflation, unemployment rate, et cetera. And then a handful of them are just index levels like Dow Jones, the Case-Shiller Housing Price Index, Commercial Real Estate Price Index, and the VIX. And so those are there with 15, 20 years worth of quarterly historical data. And then you'll notice those other two toggle buttons up top say baseline scenario and severely adverse scenario. So historical is obvious. And keep in mind the historical data does change, right? They keep coming back for multiple years and revising those calculations. So if you use some of this data and then come back a year later and you see 2023 is now different than it was, that happens. The baseline scenario are actual projections. So of all the economists that the regulators use to do these projections, a baseline scenario are actual economic based kind of middle of the road projections. The severely adverse scenario is a stress scenario. It is a hypothetical scenario. It is not actual projections. It is just if the worst happens, what might it look like, right? And so we mentioned that here. And I think make sure that when you're using this data that you're recognizing the difference between the baseline scenario, which are actual economic projections, and severely adverse, which is just a hypothetical stress, not expected to happen or be that bad scenario.
Great. Paul answered a chat. I just want to share to everybody if they aren't following along. Good morning, Leah. Thanks for the question. Is an external validation an annual thing? Paul, I don't know if you want to summarize the chat you dropped in there, the conversation, but I again encourage everybody to do it. But anything you just want to share there, Paul, before we move on?
Well, sure. It's an area that is somewhat judgmental. So you, as a member of management with the audit committee's review and approval, have to determine the risk of the different areas around the bank and how to allocate your audit resources. So interest rate risk, unfortunately, and a lot of the regulatory guidance strongly suggests an annual review, but other model validations don't have that. So I would expect that once we get this under our belt and we have our first model validation and the results are good, in other words, you don't have a lot of problems, that perhaps you could go to an every other year. Having said that, I have to warn you, there might have a regulator come in and go, oh my God, why didn't you have one done every year or the first 3 years or whatever? So I think that you should consider the CECL model, the CECL process, controls over how to establish the reserves, how to establish the provision, including the use of a model in your risk assessment, and then determine what the risk area is. If you feel like the risk that the model is being done correctly and giving reasonable results and proper governance, then you certainly seems to me that you could justify having one every other year or even every 3 years. But every time you change the model or any big components or controls over it, that usually triggers a model validation out of cycle, if you will. So I hope that's helpful.
Very helpful. And I think the only thing I would emphasize is, and Paul touched on it, right? A lot of times it is regulator roulette, right? Some regulators, as Paul said, are going to ask you for it. I have banks who've never been asked for it, even on their interest rate risk platform, right? So a lot of it is unfortunately subjective, based on the regulator who might walk in your door. So Mustafa had a question. Good morning, Mustafa. Steve, this one's probably more for you. The warm column in the loan portfolio section does not take a warm number lower than 0.13. Is there a way to get it lower? So Steve, you got
I'm aware of that limitation, and we're working on that at the moment. There's no theoretical reason why you shouldn't be able to plug in something less than 0.13. I'll tell you why it's there right now. It's there right now because typically we don't see warms very that low for any. I mean, 0.12 years would be 40 days, so that would be an average maturity of 40 days for an entire segment of your portfolio. But certainly it can happen depending upon what loans you have in that particular segment. The reason why it doesn't currently accept anything below 0.13 is we round to the nearest number of quarters when looking at when grabbing financial data results from the call reports. Anything below 0.13 or 0.12 would round to 0 instead of to 0.25. 0.25 being one single quarter of financial data. So that's the mathematical reason for it. That being said, there's no reason why we can't work around that math. And so we're currently working on removing that limitation. Now that we do have the multiplier in place and you can choose any look back period duration you want separate from the warm calculation, there's no longer really a need in the model to have it be above 0.13 or above. So in the long run, and I'll let you know as soon as that's updated in the tool where you can plug in anything, even like 0.04 if you want. And then you would choose, it would default to a 1 quarter look back period, but you can certainly expand the look back period to be 2 years, right? And still do a warm of 0.04. In the interim, if you need to do this tomorrow, what you would do is you'd plug in, you'd use 0.13, and if you want to use 0.1 instead of 0.13, then we would just do a modify your lifetime loss rate by the ratio of 0.1 divided by 0.13. So your ending lifetime loss rate, let's say it's 75 basis points, you would take that and multiply it by 0.1 over 0.13, and that would adjust it or modify it to be accurate for a warm of, let's say, 0.10. So I can give you a short-term, quick mathematical fix, and hopefully in the next month or so here, we'll have that limitation removed.
Great. Thank you, Steve. The next question is, when calculating monthly CECL model, the loss history is only provided through the last quarterly loss and does not provide any current loss history for the months after the most previous call report submitted. Steve, this is a question I think we've addressed, but I'll let you take it again. How do we build in current loss history into the model to pick that up?
Sure. Yeah, sure. And I certainly want Paul to chime in here.
Of course, yes.
Thoughts on it. It's something we get all the time. It's an extremely common question. It's a rational question to ask, and I understand why examiners, particular examiners, are asking it. Now, I want to take a little step back just into the CECL standard, right? The CECL standard does not require any particular look back period to be used when you're calculating your ACL, right? You have two components. It's the historical and then the Q factors, right? A plus B equals C, the total reserve. What data you use over what time frame for the historical component of your look back is completely subjective and simply needs to be just justified or defended as being appropriate. There's nowhere in the standard that says that if you had a charge off of any amount in the last 2 months, then that charge off, that exact value, has to be in your historical calculation during the look back period. If that were the case, that would mean that the CECL standard was defining that your look back period had to end yesterday, right? And it does not say that. So if you had a loss, let's say since the most recent quarter end, that's not reflected in your historical component, typically that's handled through a qualitative factor adjustment for a current condition change or losses since the most recent call report. Now, in saying this, I'm assuming that you want your look back period to even end at the most recent quarter. It doesn't have to. Your look back period for that segment could be 2012 through 2016 and not have anything in the last 7 years. If you can justify that historical period you think is reflective of the historical losses that you expect, and then modify further through qualitative factor adjustments. Another reason, if you had a loss, let's say a month ago, and it's not part of your historical within the look back period that the model calculates, there's two things to consider. First, is that loss materially different from the historical trend in the past that doesn't include it, right? If it's within your long-term loss patterns, it doesn't change anything in the calculations. And second, if it's out of context, a larger loss than you typically had during your historical look back period, is it something that you had already anticipated through your existing qualitative factor adjustments, right? When you ran the tool a quarter ago, if you had a Q factor adjustment because you knew there was some potential issue with that credit, and now that issue has actually happened, and now you have a charge off for it, well, if you already had a qualitative factor adjustment for it, it still doesn't necessarily mean it's going to end up in a change in your total reserve. All that being said, Paul, I'd like your thoughts on if you see this often, and if you think it's pretty typical practice to say there's always going to be some lag between my historical financial stuff and any model that I use, right? And is it appropriate to handle that lag through a qualitative factor adjustment as opposed to having to have your historical calculations take into account any charge off that's recently happened?
Right. So the purpose in looking at a historical charge off is try to predict what happens in the future. And one of the things that we use as a sounding board, or to make sure that we kind of test ourselves, our data, is to look at peer group. So since all the peers are established on a quarterly basis in our industry, and that information is always lagged, then that is a very solid foundation to stand on. So you would normally calculate your historical loss factor based on the same period of time for which you can get comparative information in peer, have a look back and understanding of how that related to economic actual activity and so forth. And then you would tweak or inform that with any current information that you know in this current quarter. But you would not necessarily go back and try to mathematically calculate that. You would simply say, well, if I had losses in the current quarter, in the current period of time until my next quarter end, does that indicate in any way that my actual data that I'm using should be adjusted? And we would normally do that through qualitative factors. So again, I can only imagine that that question comes up if you have a large unexpected loss in the last couple of months before the peer date, before the last quarter end. And so I would argue, like Steve does, that probably needs to be separately analyzed and determine whether you have, what was the root cause of that loss? Is it indicative of the same risk profile of your data in that pool? So I would ask those questions, and I would deal with that as a qualitative, and then finish the quarter and determine, okay, now has my quarterly information changed and has the peer changed? Or did I have a one-off that somehow has a root cause that's dissimilar? So that takes you to separate evaluation. It takes you to separate analysis. So there's unfortunately, we have a wonderful industry that provides quarterly data for free on everybody. But obviously there's a time lag. So, so there's a time lag. And so we just have to factor that in. So, I don't want to say you're working too hard trying to look at it monthly. I think a lot of bank management teams like to look at that monthly. But I would be careful on, how much we strain to get at that number. I would probably say if my current losses in the last couple of months are a lot higher than my loss experience, I would want to know what the root cause of that is, as opposed to questioning whether my loss experience is necessarily wrong. But that's my opinion. So
yeah, we do see, and we've had a few come in the last couple of weeks of institutions that are just getting some pressure from their examiners to take into account any losses that are outside of the look back period, more recent than the look back period. So I think that's a good way to try to you can call it pushing back, or you can call it examiner education, or whatever you want to. But I think it's the basic concept of, CECL is not supposed to be a historical accounting of your an accounting of your historical experience losses. It is an estimation of your future losses.
right.
And so, Paul and Steve, thank you for those answers. John, thanks for the question. I would just again encourage you, and if you do have an examiner who wants to discuss it, Steve and I are always available to jump on a call if you need us. The next question
comes.
comes.
Be a loom about this, and we already have a video resource where we've discussed the timing and the lag issue, but this is another good discussion of it. So we'll put a clip of this on there, and that might be one of the first things that you refer your examiner to if you get under pressure for it.
Fair enough. Good point, Steve. April's question, thank you for submitting this. I'm just starting on CECLSolver. Can I customize peer groups to have a similar loan concentration, high CRE as an example, nationally versus local asset compared? And so Steve's nodding his head, yeah, in our custom peer group filter, we can do that. Steve, I don't know if you want to show it now, or you just want to, we can do a loom, or we can have April reach out to us, but do you want to do it? Do you just want to take the screen real quick and show it?
Yeah, just for 1 minute. It'll only take a minute.
Yeah.
We do a refresher for.
I know we're getting a little here up on time, but yeah, go ahead and take the screen.
Let me
But we do have a custom peer group filter.
So right here, I know this is an internal version of the site. That's why we got this weird green or orange line up there. But to create, when you're running CECLSolver, it's going to default to what we call our QCBI state peer group. It's all the community banks in your state. You can run it on using your UBPR peer group as a peer group. You can use any custom peer group you've built, and all the way at the bottom of this list, which is new, you can run it on any UBPR peer group you want. So if you've just changed UBPR peer groups, for example, and you want to say, I'm not really in peer groups. I just crossed $1 billion. I've always been in peer group 5. Now it's showing, peer group 3 instead. You can always go back and choose a different UBPR peer group. But when you go to, if you want to create a new custom peer group to run the CECLSolver against, you would just click on custom peer groups here, and that'll take you to kind of a home page for all of the custom peer groups that you've ever built. And if you want to create a new peer group, you just click on a new specific peer group in this situation. And then you can search, you can use as your filters, it's a little slow, anything you want. You can add specific banks, you can choose a geography, so all the banks in Alabama between X and Y in assets. You might say, well, I want all the banks in Alabama, but I want them with a high concentration of CRE. So I would type in, search for a filter, CRE. All right, CRE loans percent composition is greater than 45%. Add filter and search. There are 9 banks in Alabama that have CRE loans of more than 45% of total of total loans. So, and then you would just say, you go ahead and say, well, I want to select all these guys. I want to save this peer group and give it a name. As soon as you've done that, you can navigate back to the CECLSolver, and that peer group will be in that drop-down list right there, and it's that simple.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. All right, let me just take this back. Again, thanks for everybody's time. I know we're up on the hour, so we'll try to keep things moving. As we've touched on the last couple of coffee talks, we continue to update the CECL quarterly trends from you, our users, regarding WARMs, Q factors, and ACLs, and obviously both at the median, in addition to the 25th and 75th percentile. Another question came in. You had mentioned stress testing through IntelliCredit. Is there a webinar that I could watch about IntelliCredit? I know there was a while back. Yes, there is. We're also having one come up. We just recently did a stress testing webinar last week. So Joan, I'll have we'll send you a link to that recording after the coffee talk today. We'll send that out to you. But yes, we do have we just conducted one. So I'm making myself a note.
And I want to jump to these last because there's one thing I do want to show that is new. Everybody should know at this point, not should. We've been talking about this for a few months now, all this proprietary user data and everything, and where you can find it. And yeah.
What side do you want, Steve? Do you want to go to the new
next one?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So one new thing that will be there come next week is we just tried to not reorganize. We're not trying to confuse everybody, but navigation wise on the CECLSolver, we just sort of kind of reordered the tabs a little bit so they'd be a little bit more they'd flow with how we see our users using the tool. The overview tab, and then you can see the loan portfolio, historical, Q factors, and individually assessed are kind of grouped together because that's the normal process of doing your CECL ACL for the loan portfolio. And then unfunded commitments and HTM securities, since they're separate little components, are a little separated out there. The peer data is now just called public peer data, and all those CECLSolver user trends that we just showed you before. Right now, they're only available you have to go to the knowledge base and then click on another link, and it opens up a bunch of tabs. Now it's integrated right here onto the tool. So if you click on the CECLSolver user trends tab on the right there, it'll show all that data right there without you having to open up new tabs for the knowledge base or anything. And that'll be available on Monday. You'll see the new kind of organization up top there. Nothing is missing. It's just slightly reordered and visually organized to help you guys work your way through it.
Yeah, perfect. And so we'll talk more about this next month as well, but just wanted to give you a heads up that when you log in Monday, you will see that difference.
And this is just to whet your appetite. Not next week, but sometime in the next month or so, we wanted to give people more flexibility in looking at peer data, peer historical data. So right now we calculate the peer data and show it to you based upon weighted average, like a weighted average loss methodology. But we also wanted to give you the ability to sort of almost stress test your peer historical trends in real time, right here within the tool. So there will be a new tab where you can plug in a percentile, for example. So if you want to see 90th percentile loss rates for your peers going back in time, if you're trying to justify a large Q factor adjustment, and you find that the weighted averages, the average peer data is not really justifying the amount of qualitative factor adjustment you feel that is appropriate, and you know that there's some more losses in there historically within the peer group, this gives you more flexibility to say, well, all right, forget about just the average. What kind of losses have my peers seen at the 75th percentile? or at the 90th percentile. And so you'll be able to type in a percentile from 0 to 100 for the entire portfolio or for each individual segment. And it immediately recalculate all the historical data to show you the loss rates at that percentile. So whether you're looking at it from a stress testing perspective or just want some more robust guidance as far as what the peer data has shown when you're thinking about CECL, it'll be another option there for you guys. Hopefully it'll be there before the next quarter end. So before that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think two things important to know. One, as Steve indicated, we're not doing away with the old peer data. It's still there. It'll just be one of the tabs.
It'll
Secondly,
still be there and still default. This will just be
the
second option for you to view it differently.
Correct. And then secondly, we're just borrowing technology and, kind of visual aids that we used in our stress test and use in our stress test today. And as Steve and I discussed it, we felt like, hey, this is something that, again, if nothing else for context, you could just see that same information inside CECLSolver. We felt like it was something we wanted to at least bring to you because, again, we love it in our stress test. We think that's really one of the more, really compelling pieces of our stress test is that immediacy of moving through peer numbers, almost instantaneously. We felt like, again, had application here in CECLSolver as well. So this was a pretty big undertaking to kind of replicate that and build it in here. So we're excited to add that. And again, we'll be talking about it in obviously upcoming coffee talks.
Yeah.
All right. Whoops. Go ahead, Steve. I cut you off.
No. Good.
I know we're over the hour, so thank you all for your questions. If you have any more, go ahead and submit those now. As we wait, Paul and Steve, any final comments for our group before we let them go for the weekend?
Good luck. How about that?
Oh, we're good.
Well, good. Well, if you do have any questions or need help with validation, Paul and his team at Saltmarsh they're obviously tremendous friends of QwickRate and QwickAnalytics, but they're a great resource for you as well. So, certainly reach out to them to discuss scheduling, a validation. Obviously, they have familiar with CECLSolver, so we think they're the absolute perfect partner if you're looking to do a validation. Just a reminder, again, all those past webinars and coffee talks are on our YouTube channel. Encourage you, to take us up on our free trial of IntelliCredit, as we touched on. Getting access to your internal loan metrics, I think, is a huge, huge gain for you, a huge add. It can defend or, even, potentially influence your Q factors, but having that data available to you when you want it, I think, is a tremendously valuable asset. That's really one of the things that the analyzer can immediately do for you. So I'd encourage you. We're going to work with you during that 3-month trial to help you use the tool. So we're not going to put you out there in an island. So I'd encourage you to take us up on our trial offer. In the next couple of weeks, we have some more webinars. We'll have another quarterly trend with myself and David Ruffin. We'll have a loan data coffee talk where we talk about the analyzer on November 15th. So I would certainly encourage you to register for both. If you don't attend, you will still get a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. So I'd certainly encourage you to do that. Another question came in. As a bank who hasn't experienced many losses throughout the years, we rely heavily on peer data for calculations. Is it appropriate to use a common start Q date range when looking at historical analysis? Stephen, Paul, let you. So I will just say, while you guys think about it, Oasis, thank you for the question. My interpretation is, again, our default setting is your warm and your look back period. The peer data is defaulted to match that, is to always mirror it. So it's always gonna mirror your individual bank data, again, as it relates to the warm and as it relates to the look back period that you selected. So we do think that's the natural place to start. But Steve, I can see
as
the
far
wheels
as using
turning.
So start date specifically, it's when you're thinking about the information you should be using to determine an appropriate look back period is thinking about the economic environment, right? And your local environment that existed during that look back period, and whether you think that's indicative of what you're experiencing now or what you're going to experience in the future. Since again, we're trying to predict future losses, and starting with a historical period that we think is as close to what we expect moving forward, with the Q factors bridging the difference. So if you had a segment where there was stress or losses or economic variables that were specific to that segment, and they were at a very different, obviously different period of time historically, that would be why you would really want to justify using a different starting point for your look back period for that particular segment. Otherwise, we usually start with the most recent quarter, and we go backwards whatever the warm is. That's our default. But if you wanted to use extended, longer look back periods and start all of them at a common time in the past, probably easier to make, look at the economic environment that existed at the time and say, we think that was, there was stress throughout the portfolio at a similar level throughout the portfolio. So that's why we're choosing this date. If you're choosing a look back period that's different than your warm, and choosing a start point of that look back period that's customized for every single segment, just seems like you've got a lot of work to do justifying all that. That's a lot you should probably be having to write up to give a reason why you chose a different one for each, you know what I mean? A customized and different one for each segment. Paul?
Well, I'm assuming that when you say common start Q date, you're meaning use the same start date for every layer of your loan portfolio. And generally that's not done because generally you're tying your look back period to approximately to the life of the loan. And so each layer, if one layer has an average life of 3 years and another layer has an average life of 15 years, probably your look back periods are going to be different for those two. So I'm assuming that he means, are you just going to use the same look back period for every layer of the loan portfolio? And certainly that's easy, but it's probably, you're going to get asked, why did you do that? Why isn't there an association between the look back period and the risk profile and average life of that layer of the portfolio? So again, I would encourage you just to connect the look back period to the risk profile and the weighted average life of that portfolio. So,
Yeah,
and I think that's the same thing.
Yeah, to clarify, I think I went about it in the circuitous manner. To clarify my comments, by default, our look back periods match our warms and start at or end at the same exact time, right? Last quarter.
Yeah.
And so they go backwards different amounts of time because of the length of the warms. So our default situation does have different beginnings of a look back period for each segment. And we believe that that's a good starting point. What I was saying is, if you decide to customize the length of those look back periods and not have them go back the length of the warm, but a longer or shorter length, then doing that, it changes how much you have to how much you have to justify or defend. You have to have good reasons for doing that. And then if you're doing it separately or differently for each segment, you just got a lot to write up. So I don't know how much benefit you get from that, unless again, it would be specific to something in your portfolio that would give you a really good reason to go that route.
Again, thank you for the question. If you want to discuss it further, certainly reach out to the sales and service team, and we can get something scheduled. Our next coffee talk will be December 6th. So again, you can put that on your calendars. We'll be back one more time before the end of the year. But I think that's all we have today. So again, our many thanks to Paul for joining us. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. Happy Halloween to everybody. Hope everyone has a great weekend. And Steve, any final words? Paul, any final words before we let them go?
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks for joining us. Hope everyone has a great weekend. Be safe, and we'll see you next month. Thanks so much.
Everybody.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.